Welcome to another episode of the Ginger ROAMance. Here, you'll hear anonymous stories from travellers all over the world. Real submissions from real people. Tales of connection, romance, passion, heartbreak, friendship, and love in all its forms. Because every kind of love deserves to be told. This week on the Ginger ROAMance, we share a love story set in Peru. This is a raw solo female travel story about heartbreak, self-worth, reinvention, and finding yourself after losing everything. Let's get into it. I didn't leave because I was brave. That's the part people always get wrong. When people hear that I spent 6 months traveling alone through South America after my divorce, they picture some confident woman having an eat, pray, love moment. They imagine I was standing in an airport in a linen outfit, feeling empowered. I was actually standing at departures, trying not to cry into a stale blueberry muffin. My marriage ended 3 months earlier. 22 years together, gone in one conversation. My husband sat at the kitchen table and told me he'd met someone else through work. Younger, obviously. I remember him saying, "I haven't been happy for a long time," like that sentence was somehow meant to soften the blow. The thing is, I hadn't been happy either. But I'd become so used to surviving my life that I stopped expecting joy from it. I can honestly say, I don't remember the last time anyone looked at me like I was a woman before I left. Not even me. Especially not me. I'd become invisible in my own life. The saddest part wasn't even him leaving. It was realizing how quickly I believed it made sense that he would. Of course he chose someone else. Of course I wasn't enough. Of course I got replaced. That's how low my opinion of myself had become. For years, he'd chipped away at me in ways that never sounded abusive out loud. Little comments, tiny dismissals, jokes about my age, about my body, about how emotional I was. If I dressed up, he'd asked who I was trying to impress. If I cried, I was dramatic. If I succeeded at something, there was always a reason it wasn't a big deal. Eventually, I stopped trying. Then one morning, about 6 weeks after he left, I was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the same 4 walls I'd stared at for decades, and I suddenly had this terrifying thought. If I stay here, this will become my entire identity. Abandoned wife, woman who got left behind, middle-aged woman starting over. I couldn't bear it. So I booked a one-way ticket to Peru. Not because I'd always dreamed of Peru. Honestly, I barely knew anything about it. I picked it because the flight was cheap and because it felt far enough away from everyone who knew me. I landed in Cusco, exhausted, bloated, terrified, and completely unsure what I was doing. The first week was awful. Nobody talks honestly about solo travel at my age. People online make it look like aesthetic coffee shops and meaningful sunsets. Meanwhile, I was sweating through my clothes trying to figure out how to use the washing machine in a hostel, while a 23-year-old German backpacker watched me like I was someone's confused aunt. I nearly went home 3 separate times. The loneliness was physical, heavy, especially at night. I'd spent most of my adult life with noise around me, family, television, routine, another body in the house. Suddenly, it was just me and my thoughts. And my thoughts were brutal. I remember sitting alone in a restaurant on my birthday, crying into ceviche because I felt so unbelievably pathetic. I genuinely believed everyone around me was looking at me thinking, what happened to her? But then something strange started happening. Tiny things. One morning, I found myself navigating the tiny local buses alone without panicking. Another day, I took a walking tour in broken Spanish and actually made people laugh. I started noticing men looking at me again. Not aggressively, just noticing me. That sounds shallow, but after years of feeling completely undesirable, it shook something awake in me. I'd convinced myself I had aged out of femininity, like there was an expiry date on being seen. Then one afternoon, I was sitting in a cafe in Pisac reading a book, and this man around my age asked if the seat next to me was taken. We spoke for maybe 20 minutes. He was Argentinian, divorced too. We talked about travel and grief and how weird it feels to restart your life in middle age. Before he left, he smiled and said, "You have a very bright face. You should smile more often." And I know that sounds small, almost embarrassingly small, but I went back to my room and cried because I realized nobody had spoken gently to me in years, not even myself. That became the real journey. Not countries, not flights, not adventures, softening towards myself. I started paying attention to how cruel my inner voice was. If I got lost, I'd call myself stupid. If I felt emotional, I'd call myself weak. If I looked in the mirror, I immediately criticized something. I realized my husband hadn't invented those insecurities. He'd just benefited from them already being there. That was a hard pill to swallow because it meant I couldn't blame him for all of it. Somewhere along the line, I had abandoned myself long before he did. About 2 months into the trip, I went to a small mountain town in Peru's Sacred Valley. I stayed in this tiny guest house owned by an older Peruvian woman who barely spoke English, but she treated me like family. Every morning, she would hand me coffee, and whenever I seemed anxious, she would say, "Tranquila," relax, slow down. One evening, we sat outside watching rain roll over the hills, and she asked me in Spanish why I was traveling alone. I told her that my marriage had ended. She nodded like she already knew. Then she said something I still think about constantly. She said, "Some women only discover who they are when nobody is asking them to be anything." That sentence cracked me open because my entire life had been built around being useful. Useful to my husband, useful to my family, useful at work, useful to everyone except myself. I didn't even know what I liked anymore. So I started experimenting. I took salsa classes even though I was terrible. I hiked despite always believing that I wasn't athletic. I started journaling. I spent entire afternoons sitting in parks doing absolutely nothing without apologizing for it. And slowly, I started meeting a version of myself I actually liked. She was funny. She was curious. She was resilient. She could navigate foreign countries alone. She could make friends anywhere. She could survive heartbreak without collapsing. I realized I'd mistaken familiarity for identity. Just because I'd been unhappy for years didn't mean unhappiness was who I was. Around the 4th month, I travelled to Mancora. I remember swimming alone one early morning while the sky slowly turned gold. And for the first time in years, my body didn't feel like something to criticize. It just felt useful, alive. I cried in the ocean that morning. There was a lot of crying on this trip, honestly. But it wasn't the same grief anymore. At the beginning, I cried because I felt rejected. Later, I cried because I realized how much of my life I'd spent rejecting myself first. I also started noticing how people responded to me when I carried myself differently. Back home, I'd spent years apologizing for existing, making myself smaller, quieter, easier. Traveling alone forced me to stop waiting for permission. You can't survive solo travel if you constantly need reassurance. Eventually, you have to trust your own decisions. That confidence bled into everything else. I started wearing clothes I actually liked, instead of clothes designed to hide my body. I started taking photos of myself without immediately deleting them. I stopped assuming every silence meant someone was angry at me. One night in Lima, I ended up at this rooftop bar with travelers from 6 different countries. We were dancing terribly to reggaeton, laughing, sharing life stories. And I had this surreal out-of-body moment where I realized nobody here knows me as somebody's wife. Nobody here knew the diminished version of me. They only knew the woman sitting in front of them right now. And she was enough. More than enough. That might sound dramatic, but after decades of attaching my worth to how loved I felt by other people, it genuinely changed me. For years, I treated love like proof of value. If someone chose me, I mattered. If they rejected me, I didn't. Traveling alone forced me to build an identity outside of being chosen. And weirdly, that's when I started attracting healthier connections too. Not because I suddenly became younger or prettier or perfect, but because I stopped carrying desperation. There's a certain sadness people can smell on you when you're starving for validation. I know, I carried it for years. By the final month of my trip, I felt calmer in my own skin than I had ever felt before. Not healed completely. I don't think life works like that. I still had insecure days. I still got lonely. I still wondered whether I'd trust another relationship again. But I no longer believed I was unworthy. That was the difference. On my final night, I took myself out to dinner. Nothing fancy, just wine, alpaca ravioli, and live music playing nearby. At one point, I caught my reflection in the restaurant window. And for the first time in maybe my entire adult life, I didn't immediately search for flaws. I just thought, there you are. Not the wife, not the abandoned woman, not the aging woman trying to reclaim herself. Just me. I think people assume healing arrives like fireworks, some huge cinematic breakthrough. But mine arrived quietly, in the tiny moments. Ordering coffee in another language, walking home alone at night feeling capable instead of frightened, realizing I enjoyed my own company, and looking in the mirror without cruelty. I spent years believing love was something another person gave me. Turns out, the most life-changing love story I've ever had began the moment I stopped abandoning myself. And weirdly enough, that woman that I met in Peru, she's the love of my life now. That's where the story ends, but not where my thoughts do. What hit me most about this story is how many women confuse being needed with being loved, especially in long relationships. You can spend decades being dependable, loyal, supportive, or emotionally available, and still slowly disappear inside your own life. And then when the relationship ends, it feels like you ended too. But maybe heartbreak isn't always exposing what you lost. Maybe sometimes it's exposing how long you've been disconnected from yourself already. That's the uncomfortable part nobody really talks about. So here's a question for you. Why is it that so many women only seem to meet themselves properly once they're alone? Why does it take devastation, divorce, betrayal, or burnout before they finally ask themselves simple questions like, what do I actually enjoy? What kind of life feels good to me? Or who am I when nobody needs something from me? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll catch you in next week's episode. Thanks for listening. Make sure you're following along to keep up to date with weekly stories that will inspire, entertain, and maybe even make you fall in love with the idea of love itself. Got your own romance story and want to be a part of the Ginger Romance community? Check the notes for details on how to submit your own.